Hello, I'm Adrian Ashton, and welcome to the first in this series of training induction video shorts about meetings. Now, you may remember or have seen in the schedule of sessions that we have in this program that there's also one about accounts, budgets. And you probably saw that one coming up and thought, wow, that's going to be a bit dull to get through, but I'll give it my best shot. And then you'd have seen one about meetings and thinking, my goodness, I thought accounts were dull, meetings, crikey. So let's just kind of get some things out of the way first, if we may. Most people's experiences of meetings is pretty much a mixed bag, I think, if we're honest. You'll have been together in some collaboration sometimes and just thought, shoot me now. This is just, I want to cry with the tedium of it. We're going around in circles. You'd have been to some meetings, thought, this was fantastic. It's almost as if someone sprinkled magic dust in our coffee and things are flying through. We're enjoying talking together. We can make decisions. Things are flying really well. Now, so the purpose of these short sessions in this theme is not to tell you how to do that magic dust. It's to suggest and to offer you some ideas and some tools and some approaches for how, when you are doing meetings as trustees, you can hopefully get the most out of that time. We're not going to cover the kind of some of the basics that you might already be thinking about, how to set an agenda, what the role of the chair should be, because there's lots of stuff already out there in existing materials. As we picked up in some of the governance sessions, there's lots of checklists and guides if you're the chair for how you can think about how you approach managing a meeting. Instead, the purpose of these sessions on meetings is to help you collectively as a body of trustees think about how you get the most out of the time you have together in them in the interest of the charity, because that's ultimately what the meeting is there for. It's there to help the charity progress, to help the charity better achieve and deliver on its purposes. So the focus of this first session is thinking about communication. That's quite a big, broad subject. And again, these sessions are supposed to be short, introductory, to give you a basic introduction and appreciation so that you can go off and read up more around this. You can go into other training sessions in the future. Ultimately, it's to give you a bit more of a grounding and a confidence so that you know what your fellow trustees are aware of, so you can all play together a bit more easily. So this first session is thinking about some of the issues that can come up in communication and some of the different styles and approaches we can take as we go through in them as well. Now, before we go any further, it's probably worth pausing a bit to say this is why we need to think about doing communication and doing it well. What's the business case? Because if we don't understand why we're doing something, whether that's writing a plan or creating a budget or reviewing a management report, we're not really going to engage with it properly. We're not going to give it our best. We're not going to get the most out of it for ourselves. And it will just be a bit of a waste of time. So I want to set out to you an argument as to what the business case is for good communication between you all as trustees when you come together as a corporate body to meet, to make decisions, to review progress. And it's threefold. The first is it builds trust. If we communicate well with each other, we feel more honest, more open, more appreciated, more respected. We're more likely to trust each other. And that can only be a good thing. Good communication helps us do the job better and more consistently. Good communication, if we've worked out the processes, the protocols, means that we can make the most of our time together. We're not going to get distracted with clarifying points or worrying if we're upsetting someone. Keeps us focused, helps us get on with the job in hand of being a trustee. And ultimately, good communication is part of the working out of the culture of the charity as well. Those unwritten rules, the way it feels to be a trustee, the way it feels to be part of this this charity, this organization. It builds that attitude and culture, that intangible magic dust that I mentioned earlier to go through. So this is why communication is a good idea. Now, I'm not going to go into loads of stuff about these are the models of doing it and quiz about what kind of communicator are you. I want to instead just offer some general things to be thinking about as you approach this. Now, for some of you, you might think, I know all this, I'm self-aware, I reflect on this sort of stuff all the time. And if you do, fantastic, well done. For many of us, though, my idea and experience with working with boards of charities of different sizes over the years is we can fall into bad habits. We can become complacent. We make assumptions. And one of the key assumptions is when I say something, you understand what I meant. Because we both speak English, we're both trustees of the same charity. Therefore, how I've communicated, explained something to you or written it in an email means you understand exactly what it is I meant. But that's not always the case. And what I've understood from what you've said can be a difference. And that means that we create tension and conflict because we then start talking at cross purposes. We then miss cues and cause upset that we could have avoided. So we make assumptions, and the assumptions I think that in the main that we make when we are communicating with other people, be that spoken, in conversation, in writing, by an email or such like, is we make an assumption about what they already know. We make an assumption that they know what we know, but they don't. No one's lived your life, read the books you've read, kissed the people you've kissed, had the fights you've had. So people know different stuff to us. And that means they're coming at it, their reference points are different. So we just need to make sure that if we're explaining something, we've got the same reference points. One of the other challenges we have when we communicate is life. It might be the middle of a heat wave. It might be the depths of a frozen winter. I may have just had a phone call this morning saying that a close family member has had a diagnosis of cancer. True story. I may be worried about my job because I've heard that my boss is doing a round of reviews to do redundancies, and that's distracting me. There may be a building site going on next to us. A true story. So all these distractions can get in the way, and I'm not giving you my full attention when you're explaining something to me. There's also prejudice and bias, because what I think is important might not be what you think is important. We may have different personal values. And that's why it's important to be clear what the charity's values are, because that becomes the anchor point that we ground this stuff in. But what I'm trying to get out of this life will be different to what you're trying to get out of this life. What I think is important is different to you, okay? We have different abilities as well. So some of us are naturally gifted to do maths blindingly fast. Some of us can take a piece of legislation, Companies Act, skim read it, in 5 minutes later tell us what the gist of it is in plain English. Those are fantastic gifts, but not everyone has them. So you may have a particular ability to look at forecasting data sets, but not everyone has that. So we need to find ways to bridge that understanding and capacity and capability. Part of our life experiences as well, in terms of things we've been involved before, is we use shorthand. We use verbal shorthand. Let's blue sky some thinking. We'll use amortization in the accounts. Lots of pieces of jargon and phrases and terminology that are specific to certain industries, certain markets, certain professions that you are massively in depth in. You're well rooted in that. You've lived in it all your life. So for you, this is just how you talk. But not everyone understands that jargon. It's worth pausing and checking as well. And also, the one that is probably the toughest one, and that very few of us will ever admit to, if we're honest, is we feel like an imposter. We don't feel we should really be here. We're nervous that at any point someone's going to call us out and show us up and expose us for the fraud that we think we are. Because I've only been a trustee for, say, 6 months, and you've been a trustee for nearly 3 years. Or you're a chartered accountant, and I only know basic bookkeeping, I think, but I struggled with maths at school. So I'm in awe of you. I don't feel I can question you. I'll just nod and smile, even though I don't really understand what's going on. So I'm immediately denigrating myself because I'm comparing myself to you. And we don't always realize that. And that, again, starts to create barriers. So there's all these barriers and filters that come in between what you're saying and what I'm hearing and what I'm understanding, that if we don't think about them, will confuse the message. Will mean that what we've said hasn't been properly understood. Will make it harder to reach a decision or a consensus. It's worth doing some basic sanity checks from time to time. Another aspect about communication I think it's interesting to think about is the style in which we are communicating. And there's a chart here on the screen that suggests that the manner in the format in which we communicate with other people, be that verbally, in writing, or a phone call, will differ depending on the circumstances and the context. So it may be, as a body of trustees, we need to make a quick decision about something. We've got to be focused on the task and the result. We've got to make a quick decision. So we're in the upper part of the axis. And because we don't have a lot of time to make this decision, we've got to be quite directive. We've got to drive it through. We don't have time to be nice, to be gentle, to carry along with us. We've just got to focus on driving it. And if we all recognize that, it's easier to have the conversation, to structure the email thread. Just about that mindfulness to frame the decision. If, however, it also works the other way. So as well as the issue that we've come together in the meeting to be focused on, it may be that actually we as individual trustees have personal values. We have factory default settings, as it were, that are different to yours. So I don't like Marmite, but you might. That doesn't mean I'm better or worse than you. It just means that's our default setting on our taste buds. And there's a similar thing with how we approach coming together with people to undertake activities. We may be more interested in hearing other people's views before we come to a decision. So we may be more of that left side of the screen there, more amicable, more analytical. And other people who are more focused on the other side of this grid may view that as saying, oh, they're not really interested. But it's simply that we have a different preference, a different style for how we're approaching the issue. And that impacts upon how we communicate, how we frame it, how we present it. So that's a couple of key things there to think about in terms of issues about communication. Ultimately, of course, if you've skipped ahead to this part of the session, this is the executive summary part. If you remember nothing else, a piece of jargon to illustrate the early point, TLDR, too long, didn't read. Or in this case, too long, didn't listen or watch. The two key points I want to hopefully get across to you, and you've taken from this, are that the manner in which you communicate will change over time. You'll be influenced by how much time you have available and what the point is that's catalyzed you to want to talk or send a message to other people. It's a decision, it's for information, it's team building, it's a threat to the charity. All these things have an impact upon how we approach communicating. So we need to be mindful of that before we even open our mouths or start typing the first word. And the other thing is, once we have issued that content to other people, it's useful to check. So very often you hear people talk about active listening. We encourage people to be active listeners. You can also do that as the communicator by doing sense checks. Once you've issued the content, the information to other people, test it, test them on it, make sure they've understood it. Try and find ways that you can ask them to maybe tell it back to you, summarize it back to you, just to make sure that you're confident they've understood what you intended. Some of this kind of sounds a bit like common sense, and some of it, a lot of the time, we do intuitively. but not always. So it's useful to have refreshers like this from time to time. So lastly, this has just been a short session just to introduce the concept of thinking about how as trustees we do meetings, and particularly about conversations that come up in them. And this first one's been about how we approach those conversations, making sure people have understood what we've said and that we've structured it in an appropriate way as well. Other shorts we've got coming up in this theme are, well, doing the difficult stuff, difficult conversations. We need to talk to somebody. We need to discipline someone, issue a grievance, challenge them on a behavioral issue. How do we approach that? Because we don't want to upset people if we can help it. We don't want people not to like us. So how will some of the ideas that we can approach that with? We have another one, which is about decision making. Sometimes as trustees, you are faced collectively, you're in the meeting, there's an impossible choice. Do we save the hamsters or do we save the squirrels? We can only save one of them. What's the lesser of two evils? How do we approach that decision? How can we stand by it? How do we make sure we can explain it to other people? And then a little bit about thinking about how, as a body of trustees, you engage with any paid staff that the charity employs, and also then with volunteers who are interested in supporting the work of the charity as well. So this has just been a short first session, thinking about the issue of meetings as trustees, how you approach some of these themes within communication. And hopefully it will mean that as a body of trustees, you're more comfortable and confident in how you work together. And also through this process, you maybe recognize something more about yourself. And that means you enjoy life a bit more because you become a bit more self-aware about what works for you and what works for other people, which means you can all get along a bit better. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you in the next session.